Yeah, I've got a couple that really stand out. I think one that stands out, it's kind of funny. So involves a fax machine, kind of like the old school greasy fax paper machines. But it's 2003. So we started in 2002. I don't even know if we got our first sale until 2003. But so it's 2003, and we're in a building, and it's both Vortex and Eagle Optics. So Eagle Optics had started first. It was an e-tailer, mail order company, had a small showroom, and it was a dealer of everybody's products, and so that allowed us to learn how to launch what would become Vortex. And then Vortex was just starting in the same building, so we shared a lot of stuff, and we shared the fax machine. So all the orders came in on one fax machine. The fax machine was in our copier room, which was also doubled as our conference room. It was the biggest room in the building, which I think was maybe like a 25 by 10, 12 feet. So not very big. And you would always go by this magic fax machine, and I called it a magic fax machine because that's when the orders would appear. So you're always going by there. You probably needed to copy your stuff, and it was also with, in between room to get to somewhere else. And then of course you check the fax machine for the orders. So I'm walking by there one day, and on the ground is a fax, just sitting there almost like a piece of trash, which would happen sometimes because the faxes would build up and maybe one would fall over. And so I went down and I grabbed it, and I turn it over, and it's a $50,000 purchase order that Eagle Optics had sent one of our competitors. And I was like shocked, because up until that point, I remember distinctly the largest order I had was $2,200. I mean, it was, right? You remember. And I remember when I had a $2,200 order, I remember all 35 people at Vortex, I'm like, we need to go out for like the nicest steak dinner, which would have been funny because we would have been in the hole. The profit on the $2,200 wouldn't have covered the dinner. But that's how I felt. So when I see this $50,000 purchase order, I was like, whoa, like I didn't even know these existed. I thought it was like a unicorn. But it's not for Vortex. It's Eagle Optics order to another brand. So I walk it back to the buyers of Eagle Optics, and they I handed it to them. I was like, guys, this is on the floor. Like, you might want to, frame this, and so they just kind of grabbed it and were just sort of like, oh yeah, that. They're like, we've sent that in 3 or 4 times. We still haven't heard back from them. And I was like, what? I'm like, rewind that. You sent this in 3 or 4 times, a $50,000 purchase order, and nobody's even responded? And they were like, yeah. They're like, that, and that's pretty normal. They're like, we actually kind of think they hate their dealers. And so that was one of a handful of moments where it clicked. I was like, oh man. I'm like, if that's how they are with a retailer like Eagle Optics, which is a pretty big retailer. I mean, it was an independent retailer, but it did a fair amount of business. It was the number 1 in the birding market, and they pay their bills on time. This is a good dealer to have. If that's how they treated them, I was like, it's only a matter of time. I didn't know how long. I knew it was going to take a long time, but I was like, if that were me, I had in my head, I was like, I would have driven the order to the retailer. I would have had a red carpet. I would probably have somebody playing trumpets. Like, it would have been, and at the very least, I would have confirmed the order within minutes, if not seconds. So I just kind of knew if that is how they're treating retailers, that's something that we'll do completely opposite, and the dealers are going to love us for it. They're going to love us for it. So, of course, you have to have a good product. You have to execute on the product quality and all these other things, but that service-oriented piece and really caring and giving a rip about your dealers and your customers and having that show up in how you act and you treat them, and also in the speed at which you respond to something that's important to them, like a $50,000 purchase order, that's a litmus test if you actually care. Because everybody says they care, but it's sort of like, well, how do you know that you really do care? You can just say it, but does that actually mean it? No, like, it shows up it leaves evidence. And so a $50,000 purchase order on the floor that you have had to send 3 or 4 times and still haven't got a confirmation, that was evidence that they didn't care. And I knew we did. So that was a really big difference, a really pivotal moment. And then as often happens, you notice something intuitively, and then later, years later, somebody gives you language for it. So this kind of came from an unlikely place, but eventually got married, have kids. I'm trying to be a better husband. So I'm reading a book by John and Julie Gottman, who are kind of like the researchers for what makes for successful relationships, in this case, a marriage relationship. And they talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which are these things that show up in a marriage relationship that just kill the relationship. And I won't go into all of them, but the number one of the 4, the worst of the 4 horsemen, is contempt. And I remember when I read that, I was not so much thinking about my marriage relationship, because I didn't really feel like contempt was showing up, or the other 4 horsemen. But I actually remembered the moment with the fax machine, and I remembered our competitors and how they treated the retailers is with contempt. The way they spoke about dealers was with contempt. The way they interacted with them was contempt. It was the classic, when the phone rings and it's customer, it's like, oh, one of those again, right? And that's because what happens a lot is, and this happens in the marriage relationship, is at the beginning, it's the honeymoon phase. You open up a brand new retailer and they're giving you orders, maybe $50,000 purchase orders, and you're really ecstatic about it. But then all of a sudden you get to year 5, and those $50,000 purchase orders are just coming in. They're just coming in. So you do what is natural for a lot of times human beings, is you take it for granted. And then you start getting annoyed by the other things. Like, oh, when George from XYZ company calls, who gives me $50,000 purchase orders, I'm gonna have to be on the phone for 20 minutes. Ugh. Like, and I don't like his accent, because he's from wherever, and it's hard to understand him. And you come up with all these reasons to have like contempt, when instead you're like, oh wow, George placing those orders and selling our products to customers actually keeps the lights on around here, actually allows me to have a paycheck, which actually allows me to buy food and care for my family. And so you all those things that are really wonderful things about that relationship, you just take them for granted, you put them over here, and you just focus on what really is a lot of times very small things that just kind of bug you, and then those become the main things. So ironically, from a marriage, book and couple and researchers, this idea of contempt, what I realized was, oh, that's any relationship. It's not just a marriage relationship. It can be an employee. It can be a dealer. It can be any relationship. Those 4 horsemen, and what makes for a good relationship or a bad relationship in a marriage also shows up in your business. So that was a huge epiphany, and it was also a consistent reminder that when we see a dealer, when we see an employee, when we see a customer, we see them first for all of their strengths, all of the great things that they bring to the table. We don't see them for, and I'm going to use quotes here, the negatives. Because a lot of times they actually aren't even negatives. They're just things that kind of trip your trigger. And when you start from that place internally, that actually shows up in all the different nuanced ways that you treat that person. They're going to feel it. If you see somebody for their strengths, they're going to feel it and they're going to know. And guess what? They're going to be open to when you've got potential criticism or constructive criticism or something like that. But when you see somebody for their weaknesses and then you do some constructive criticism, it's not going to work. They're not having it. And the reason is because there's contempt there. There's not respect. And so that was a really big moment. And then later getting language for what was going on there, and then knowing we've got to keep that out of our building, because eventually Vortex got to be number 1. And actually that brand, which I won't use their name, they were number 1 at the time in 2003. They had the most sales, the most business, and then we got there, and it was like, and then our phone is ringing, and it's less now than it was in 2003. We still do get some faxes, but we got better paper. And the emails come in, and they come in like clockwork, and it's easy to take it for granted. So we have to be really intentional about celebrating not just our end customers, but selling the dealers that really allow us to connect with the end customers, and make sure that we don't take them for granted, and make sure we see them for all the strengths they bring to the table, and not for the quote unquote negatives or maybe some of the friction points that we have with dealers.